Hi, everyone. Those of you from my podcast and those of you from my YouTube short. Hi. Happy Halloween, everyone. I know this is going to be kind of late because I just realized, holy moly, I forgot to do a Halloween episode, and I love Halloween. So I'm going to give the books that I like this year. The first one is The Getaway. I just love the fact that it's such a dystopian capitalistic story in which the one thing that I love about dystopian, and I wish more stories talked about dystopian, is that it's very much a human versus something. And in this case, it's a human versus a corporation, and a human versus nature, and a human versus prejudice, and it's surviving against this as its amusement park during the end of the world. And you don't really get the scope of just how much the world has been changed and shifted because of the amusement park and by the people that run it. I have a whole thing that I'm going to probably do on my YouTube channel, Shield of Vala, and on my Tumblr, also Shield of Vala, where I discuss a crossover that I could imagine with the plot of The Getaway and Far Cry 5. I have these weird videos. So, the second book I want to talk about is The Darkness Outside of Us, in which a space explorer goes to space to save his sister, but there's a series of elements that just don't seem right. Not only does he learn that he has someone else on the ship that he has to work with, but the AI, for all its help, seems to be hiding something. And as series of events go on, he learns that his mission isn't exactly what it seems. In fact, reality may not be exactly what it seems. It's a fascinating twist for sci-fi. It gets the element of sci-fi really well, but it gets that suspense and that terror of the unknown and being trapped and not having control so well that it's amazing, excellent. I adored it the first time I read it. I adored it so much that I actually got the audiobook. Let's go on. Digging Two Graves. I almost forgot Digging Two Graves. Oh my goodness. I will be honest, and I will say that the first part of Digging Two Graves was not something that I really found interesting. I didn't find this book interesting, the first part of it. I thought it was just generic, and it just felt like a generic thriller novel, like a high school novel. And then gets to the second part, and oh my goodness, the twists and turns. You have this expectation of the story, and then it hits you with so many turns and twists. So the main plot of Digging Two Graves is of this young girl who, after a situation, basically becomes an outcast in her high school. Her best friend isn't her best friend. She feels alone. So her grandmother sends her to this camp for leadership. And so she ends up going to this camp. She really hates him. She's not really a fan. And she goes there and she meets this girl who's also an outsider. They start talking about their situation, the fact that she has reasons for wanting to get rid of her stepbrother because he also did things that made her an outcast. And so jokingly, she said, okay, you get rid of my friend and I'll get rid of your brother. They're joking. She's joking. She's thinking she's joking. And the friend, who she thinks of her as a friend because they're both outsiders, tells her, okay, I'll do that. But you'll have to once I do it, it's your job. And so school starts, and she gets the news that her best friend is dead. And everyone thinks it's her. And she gets, I read it a while back, so I have to remember. I believe she gets a text, because that's creepier than a note. Although she does, the girl, her friend, the other outsider, he does end up breaking into her house because she can't do that, just to show how much power she has over her. She sends her a text now it's your turn, and it's creepy and bizarre, and that second part and how much pressure she puts on her and how much she feels like she's driven into a corner makes what I thought was going to be kind of a generic teen thriller into a really actually kind of unsettling psychological thriller. And I absolutely adore it. I adore the fact that the main character's favorite mystery novel is Agatha Christie. There's a lot of characters that feel real and three-dimensional, and they have their issues. They're good characters. They're not good people, but they can acknowledge their issues and they can fix their issues. And those that don't want to change, deal with it. And it's a good. I adored it. It's one of my favorite spooky books that I read this year. Probably wouldn't recommend it much because I feel like I have to give spoilers. Yeah, the first part of the book is kind of dull and boring, but that's because it's making you lower your expectation. The second part, oh my gosh, it blows your mind away. Totally not professional. She is Haunting. It's a fascinating horror kind of house. It's very almost like The Shining, except with a Vietnamese twist to it. So it's about a young girl who goes to her estranged father who lives in Vietnam, who basically abandoned her family, who lives in the United States. And he's fixing up this old Victorian house. I believe it's a Victorian house. Not entirely sure. Let me get all Frenchy. It's a French house from the time where France was colonizing Vietnam. And she has to help set up the site to make the mansion into a B&B. Except she's having these really terrible nightmares, and she wakes up basically completely paralyzed, and she is just not having a fun time with this. She's already dealing with kind of heavy things, being the fact that she is a bi girl. I believe she's bi. Pretty sure she's bi. And dealing with kind of a pregnant father, and a father who basically blames her for being the reason he leaves the house, even though he's an adult and totally have the choice of staying or leaving. But she's dealing with all that stuff. But then she's also dealing with the fact that the house has ghosts, and she can see them, and the house wants something from them, and she has no idea what it is. And the only ally that she has can't tell her exactly what's going on. So, yeah, she doesn't know who to trust. Even the one person she thinks that she can trust ends up not being trustworthy. With not the reasons you think. It's a whole other drama, not trauma. She has enough trauma as it is. Drama that you could imagine. So it's a really good horror story. I recommend it. La Hacienda is another really good story that strangely I read together, but I read La Hacienda for a book club, and La Hacienda is a combination of, again, kind of like The Shining and Rebecca, in which a young girl during the Mexican Revolution basically loses her family wealth and ends up, like many young women in Latin American cultures, getting married to the first rich person she can find to be able to help out her mother and stuff, help out her family. Because the prestigiousness of a family will take you for the rest of your life. Your family, all of your family. So the fact that her father was killed really looks bad. So she needs to find a way to elevate her family name and her legacy. So she ends up in La Hacienda, and she finds out that La Hacienda is haunted, and it's full of much more than ghosts and much more than drama and trauma. And so she has to find an ally who can help her without her going completely crazy. She needs to find someone who believes, and but that person also has some dark history in this. Yeah, I highly recommend it. It's really good. I'm glad that I got to read it for a book club. I'm actually going to try to reread it again because I only heard it as an audiobook. So I really want to read a lot of the dialogue. It's a good book. We Don't Swim Here is, I saw the title of it, and I saw the cover of it. The cover is impressive. And I'm like, well, this is really fascinating, because I knew a lot about the civil movement and whatnot, specifically how African-American, Black people of color weren't allowed to swim in the southern areas. It's like, oh, what's this about? It's is it a horror about swimming and being a person of color? So I'm like, okay, I'll pick it up. And so it is, in a way. It's about a young girl who ends up having to move in the small little town that her father was from. And she has to give up everything, including, and most importantly, her swim team. She's been swimming since she can remember. She loves swimming. She adores swimming. Except while this town has a lake, a pool in the rec center, and a pool in the high school, Nobody in the town swims. And while that's kind of intimidating and scary, the most intimidating and scary thing, which I couldn't really talk about in the short, because in the short, is the fact that when she brought her cousin over for like a trip or something, and they tried to teach her how to swim, because her parents were like, you should teach her how to swim. They went to the pool, and the moment the female lead went into the water, her cousin just screamed and screamed and screamed bloody murder. And so they got kicked out. And later on, she told her, why didn't you burn him? And nobody in this town talks about swimming. Like, the idea of swimming is like a foreign taboo thing. Like, that's not something you do. No one goes and swim. That's a ridiculous notion. And there's also rituals, because the story is told by two points of view: the cousin of the female lead and the female lead. And in the cousin's female lead, the cousin's point of view, you find out that the town has these traditions, which, yeah, kind of makes sense. Small towns have like a ton of traditions, but if you don't follow said traditions, you can be punished and it can end your life. So, like, that's intimidating and scary and terrifying. And yeah, it's a fascinating book on trauma. And yes, there's ghosts. And I jokingly went with my cousin, like, she's possessed. And then, like, later on in a couple of chapters, no, she's back to normal. And then she's like, no, never mind, she's still possessed. Well, I joke about it. It's actually a really fascinating book on, like, trauma and, like, memories, and the way we think about people in our past affects our future, and the way sometimes a monster is a victim, and sometimes a victim is a monster. And it's super fascinating and interesting. The Insomniacs is another book that I read, which is a really urban thrill, which our female lead falls from a diving board during a swim meet. I can't remember the name of it in the short, and I was recording the short, but it's a swim meet, and she falls on her head, causing her to have head trauma. And so one of the fun things about that is she can't swim, and she's in her junior year, I believe. Like, she's in a critical time where she's getting used to getting scouted, and so her coach is like trying to push her back into swimming, and she's having these headaches. But the most important thing is she can't sleep. And that's an issue, but that's not too bad. Except for the fact that there's been break-ins throughout her neighborhood. And so now she's not just worried about the fact that she can't sleep, but she's worried that if her not being able to sleep is causing her to have visual and auditory hallucinations. To make things more interesting, the boy next door, or as she calls it, the boy across the street, is also having insomnia, so they're hanging out together. So she's having to hide the fact that she has a massive crush on him. So that's not fascinating aspect of it. It's an interesting thriller. Now, it may sound like, oh, it's just a slice of life. No, there is, in fact, situations where she deals with the fact that there's something going on in her neighborhood that she can't trust her sight and her hearing, because she is having such a hard time recognizing if they're just from her lack of sleep. So that's a really fascinating thing. As someone who also does actually have insomnia, I can recognize it. Although I did not like the fact that it took until like the latter part of the book for her to like discuss feeling of nausea. Because that's one of the big things I get when I have like 2 hours of sleep. Because insomnia. Yeah. I have 2 more books that I want to talk about. Yay. The Delicious Nest is, I don't know if I want to say if it's a darker version or a lighter version of the Fresh Bodies books. I can't remember. In the Flesh, which is about the aftermath of the zombie apocalypse. The Death is Delicious is basically that standpoint where it is the aftermath. People who have been infected, or in this case called the Hollow, have been treated, they don't have medication like in the flesh, but they're manageable, and they can be able to consume artificial in any, I just don't want to say the actual term, but yes, there are a page full of trigger warnings because of that reason. So there's cannibals. Delightful for me as a Hannibal fan. And it's about these group of friends who, after the apocalypse, are going to a music festival. And everything seems lively and happy, but not everything is what it seems. And they end up dealing with some signs that something is going on, and it's not good. I will say, the one thing I didn't like is the fact that the trigger warnings kind of spoil it all in the book, so I'm not going to give all of the trigger warnings, but it's a really fascinating exploration on someone dealing with a traumatic experience and survival skills and like a lot of that. And also just someone learning when to break off with toxic parents. Because there is this strange parents and it's not the female lead's fault. And there's a diverse cast and it's a fascinating read. The thing is, I have a really soft close place to In the Flesh, and In the Flesh it's much more darker and much more realistic than the Delicious Darkness, but it has this mystery and thriller aspect to it, and it's amusing. I would say it's amusing, although again, In the Flesh, it's more fascinating to me. Because In the Flesh they have medication to take, and if you don't take that medication, they go crazy. And in this case, it's kind of the opposite effect. So kind of weird. Like I don't know how they like. Yeah, absolutely. Watch In the Flesh if you want to. It's a 2 seasons on BBC. Will give a warning. It will break your heart. It got canceled at the 2nd season, so we won't get a satisfying ending. And yeah, if you want to watch it, and then afterwards just lay on the floor sobbing and going like, "Why the heck did I watch this? This broke my whole entire heart, and now I'm brokenhearted." For Halloween, In the Flesh. I had a friend who recommended it to me, and the hilarious thing is, I did lay on the floor sobbing, going like, "What the heck? Blank has no meaning." And that person is a person that made me realize that I like women. Yeah. The third one is that I finished 2 days ago, and so there's a short of it. Yeah, on YouTube, you see the short, which is nothing more to tell. I'm moving this idiot shit, which is about a young girl who, because of reasons, I'm not gonna get it. Richard papers that will have a different meaning if you read the book. I just thought it's like, because I didn't want to say the actual thing, but it's a Richard paper because she wanted to uncover some sample that was going on in the school. She ends up having to quit the newspaper, and then her dad gets a transfer to the hometown that she hasn't been there for 3 years since the death of her beloved teacher. It has nothing to do with the teacher. Her dad just got transferred. And so, being the fact that she wants to be a reporter, that's a big thing. Like, everything in her life has been going to becoming a reporter. She decides to do an internship for a true crime kind of thing. And again, she has this great story. Her teacher was found dead 3 years ago by 3 of the students, and nobody knows who did the crime. And there's also the fact that there was a bunch of money missing. And so it's a fascinating book. And I love the fact that none of the characters, not even the suspects, are good people. And I like this about this author. I've heard like multiple times that her books are kind of like that. Like that's one thing you're not going to like about them is the fact that none of these characters are good people. And oh my gosh, nothing more to tell has that in spades. All of these characters are teenagers, and so they can act really selfishly, and they act in their own, what they believe is their own well-being. And it is fascinating and amazing, and I absolutely adore it. But if you really can't get into like unlikable characters, and you need characters to be someone you can relate to, I do not recommend it. If you're fine reading about characters who are just a bit of messed up and have a story to tell and are trying their best, nothing to tell. It's a great Halloween read. So yeah, that's my recommendation for this Halloween. Have a nice spooky day, and hopefully I can post this by that day or not. I hope you had a great Halloween.